Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Thursday, August 7th, 2025, and on Thursdays we talk about knowledge and science. And the theme this week for the Dr. J Vlog series has been cruelty, the counterpart in many respects to empathy, which we discussed last week. So I'm actually going to return to empathy today and then again reintegrate the discussion of cruelty. So in academic and public life, generally speaking, we think of empathy as being a fundamental force, a key aspect of our morality, right? A psychological phenomenon that's rooted in biology, but also has profound implications culturally in terms of the law, policy, and so on. So the thing is that the roots of empathy, and then by extension cruelty, are to some extent biologically determined, but there's also a cultural component as well. At least that's my main argument. So again, what do we mean first by empathy? Recall that we discussed this last week when we talked about the difference between the emotional and the cognitive component. Usually the contemporary neuroscientists and the psychologists talk about the degree to which you're able to match the relationship between the emotions that two people experience, the agent and the target, so to speak. And so an agent's response or emotion is empathetic if it's caused by and then resembles or matches the target's emotions, right? So I'm empathizing if your sadness then makes me feel sad, but not if it brings me pleasure, right? Then I'm being cruel or sadistic. Okay, and so it's in this sense I think of cruelty as being the mirror opposite, or at the other end of the continuum, if you will, from empathy. So again, in terms of the cognitive and the emotional aspects, okay, this literally occurs physiologically in terms of our neurological circuits in the areas that include the premotor cortex, the inferior parietal lobe, and other aspects of our brains that then allow us then to activate our bodily expressions and feelings, our somatic responses, so to speak. So in a nutshell, these various neurological components combine to produce the experiential sensation of feeling for someone else or something else. And it's actually measurable in terms of our neurobiological and physiological responses. But then there's the cognitive aspect as well, or what we call, cognitive empathy, if you will, or empathy 2, it's sometimes referred to. And that's where we process the information about our neurological experiences and the outcomes of the various actions that are taken in the presence of this kind of stimulus. So it's an odd sort of play on Descartes' claim, right? That we think, therefore we feel, if you will. So, and then depending upon our interpretations, we can change how we feel about things. It's exactly the same as when we process information that tells us we should be angry or not. So for example, I'm angry that you were inconsiderate yet again and you showed up late because you just didn't care and you got sidetracked because of your own selfish reasons or what have you. But what if I learned then that you were late because you'd been attacked by a dog and seriously injured, or something horrible happened to you? And yet you still managed to come. You showed up 30 minutes late. So my response to your being late is obviously going to change based on the new information. And the same thing applies with respect to empathy. If someone's sad because something terrible happened to them beyond their control, then that activates the empathy, the empathic responses, right? And if we're reasonably normal, usually our cognitive empathy responds as well. That is, we become aware of and then empathetic to their plight. And these sort of become self-reinforcing, both our somatic, our physiological reactions, and then our intellectual and cognitive responses to how we're feeling. So if, on the other hand, we learned that the person who had something bad happen to them had brought it on themselves, or that they were responsible for their own misfortune, or that they're just bad people in general, we'll often respond differently, based on those interpretations. So it's the difference, say, for example, between somebody who's, out there driving normally and safely and running errands for their elderly parents one night, and then unfortunately gets rammed by a drunk driver and ends up being seriously injured. We'd feel for that person almost certainly, right? Versus the person who's had too much to drink, ignores their friends and the recommendations, doesn't care, gets in their car anyway, goes out and recklessly drives around and then runs their car into a tree and gets seriously injured. Again, in case 1 and case 2, both people end up seriously injured, but we tend to be far less empathetic in the second instance. So the degree of empathy then can change quite dramatically. And that's, in my view, what feeds into our capacity then to feel more mean-spirited or cruel towards others in their situations. So where do these empathetic and then conversely the cruelty responses come from? Well, again, there's kind of this raging debate between nature and nurture, between one side that argues it's rooted in our genes and part of our human nature, affording us evolutionary advantages, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there are those who are just as vehement that empathy and cruelty are learned responses that we model in response to other people's behaviors and the ways in which they respond to different situations. And this is through a process of associative learning. And it's almost certainly both, at least in my view, and they almost certainly interact with one another. That is to say, we're both born with varying capacities to relate to others neurologically and emotionally, but it's our cultural context then that allow us to develop the matching of our feelings and the associations with specific conditions. We do seem to be pre-programmed, by the way, to identify things in nature that more closely resemble ourselves, such as differentiating between people and non-people, and even things like facial recognition. And so what we're exposed to then early on also further reinforces our capacity for our pre-programmed responses. So if I see my mother or my caregiver on an everyday basis for several hours, for example, and especially, from infancy right on forward as a toddler, then I'm going to grow accustomed to their looks, to their sounds, to their smells, their cadences, and their reactions to different stimuli. And in effect, my developing brain is going to start making associations about the types between linking how I'm feeling somatically, what my body's experiencing, and then what I'm cognitively processing. And then that's the stuff then that gets hardwired, if you will, into that developing brain. Again, just like the language that you and I learn. And in that sense, we start learning right from the outset, even though we don't have the cognitive abilities yet as infants to be able to express what we're feeling and experiencing in words. We learn, though, to associate our physiological and our physical experiences with certain feelings. And then we give to those certain interpretations, certain responses, if you will. And we learn in that sense to become caring and empathetic people. But then again, depending upon our exposure, how far does that care and compassion and empathy extend? Usually there are limits, mainly focusing on our immediate environments of our caregivers, our loved ones, our families, and so on. And then to varying degrees, we'll extend that outward towards other categories that fit within our cognitive and moral frameworks. Some people are more like us, or more human, or more deserving than others, again, depending upon our cognitive and moral frameworks. And then that helps shape our responses. So for nearly everyone, for example, we'd be empathetic towards an infant that's suffering. Infant X, generic infant X, if you will. Again, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their nationality, and so on. If an infant's suffering, who among us wouldn't? Again, without even thinking, if they were in our presence and we could do something to help that infant, most of us would automatically respond that way, right? They're just innocent babies, after all. And who doesn't feel for babies? Who hates babies? And then if, again, tragedy were to befall an infant, no matter what infant, almost all of us would have that sort of visceral and empathetic response, both, by the way, toward the infant and probably towards the infant's mother or caregiver, whoever as well. We'd be feeling for them. And so that's why it was so shocking, at least for me the other day, when I was looking at some responses to the starvation that's happening in Gaza right now, and the children that are losing their lives, etc. And sometimes, of course, the direct killings of the children by Israeli soldiers. And so on the one hand, there's footage of Israeli soldiers actually celebrating the killing of Gazan children. And that strikes me as not only the absence of empathy, but something much more akin to cruelty and sadism. And then I saw two specific instances where two young and they were young. I don't know if they were teens, late teens, early 20s, but two young Jewish women in Israel who stated on camera in an interviewing type of situation that they just didn't care that the children in Gaza were dying. And one specifically stated that she was glad that Gazan infants were dying. And then the interviewer repeated, wait, they seemed shocked. You're okay that it's infants dying? I mean, these are human beings, you know. And she kind of just laughed it off and said, well, I'm a human being too. And basically implied that no, it didn't matter, to her at least, because of who those infants were, right? So it's probably equally shocking to most of us then when we're confronted with that type of careless indifference or cruelty. And by the way, I'm not meaning in any way to pick on these handful of Jewish cases that I've just referenced. There's also footage, if you go back to looking at situations where Hamas, when they were doing their killings, when they did their initial launch back on October 7th, and then killed a number of Israelis, and then took some hostages. There's, again, equally disturbing videos of their treatment of their Israeli captives and their indifference and so forth to the suffering of the Israeli children, right? So the point is this applies to, the same dynamics apply across the different types of religions and nationalities and peoples with all kinds of different cultural backgrounds. And that's why when we look across the world, both into contemporary and looking further back in history, we see so many instances of these inter-ethnic and inter-religious clashes, in particular international clashes, that lead to large-scale killings, mass killings, genocides, etc. Okay, so again, this is the learned aspect, I would argue, for the most part. It goes beyond just human biology. And in fact, what we're talking about then is the degree to which human beings develop in certain contexts a capacity to be unspeakably cruel to one another too. So on the one hand, as last week, we can talk about the extent to which we can embrace and appreciate the degree to which human beings have this enormous capacity to be empathetic towards one another, even to people that are not in their immediate families or, that don't fall into their quote unquote normal cultural groupings. And it's extraordinary what some people are able to rise to and how they're able to look beyond the narrowness of their own backgrounds. And then by the same token, we see these other cases, these other instances, and again, cross-culturally and historically, where we're just stunned at the level of human cruelty that people are able to inflict upon one another, okay? And so again, in terms of the learned aspect, we're going to look at that more tomorrow in terms of the learned capacities for empathy and cruel responses that are conditioned by our cultural backgrounds and what we're exposed to. And I mean, that's also where we people learn then to establish much narrower or broader boundaries around their empathic capacities as well as their capacity for cruelty towards others. Okay. So, and again, if you don't think this is relevant to your own situation, you can think of all kinds of common events today and things that are happening, whether you're talking about what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians, whether you talk, well, just think of another example. What if if your best friend, for example, were involved in sex trafficking of young children, would you be okay with that type of cruelty, or would you intervene? I mean, first of all, what's your best? How come that person's your best friend? Secondly, what would you do? Right? Presumably, you would be empathetic towards the young children that are being trafficked, right? Not sadistic or cruel. You'd hope that this would be obvious. But clearly, there are people out there who don't care if children are being subjected to sex trafficking or other types of unspeakable cruelty, right? And then, of course, there's a small number of people who engage directly in such practices. So again, in tomorrow's vlog, we're going to look at the drivers of the cultural boundaries that define our capacity to extend empathy versus cruelty, again, more broadly or more narrowly. In effect, what explains the variations in empathy and cruelty that we observe. All right, until then, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance, at least for your own kind, right? and perhaps more broadly? Okay, we'll see you soon.